The rain fell in relentless, slanting sheets, blurring the city lights into a watercolor wash of gold and silver against the black canvas of the night. From her third-floor window, Beatrice Holloway watched the world drown. Below, the streets of Chicago glistened like polished obsidian, reflecting the headlamps of Ford Model Ts that splashed through the avenues with a careless energy she no longer possessed. A mournful saxophone wailed from a hidden speakeasy somewhere down the block, its melody a seductive, sorrowful tune that seemed to mock the profound silence within her small apartment. The Roaring Twenties, they called it. For Beatrice, it was only a whisper of ruin. It had been 3 months since Walter was gone, 3 months since the world had tilted on its axis and thrown her into a cold, desolate orbit. The scent of his pipe tobacco still clung stubbornly to the armchair in the corner, a ghostly presence she both cherished and resented. His photograph on the mantelpiece, a handsome, beaming face full of life and easy promises, was a daily torment. He had promised her forever, a life buffered from hardship, but forever had turned out to be tragically brief, and the buffer was as thin as the paper his debts were written on. Her hand rested instinctively on the gentle swell of her belly, a secret she had carried alone for 6 weeks. It was Walter's final gift and her most terrifying burden. A child, a new life to bring into a world where she could barely sustain her own. The joy that should have been a bright, warm flame was instead a cold, heavy stone in her heart. How could she celebrate a beginning when everything else felt like an end? The final blow had come that afternoon. A crisp, formal letter slid under her door, its typewritten words as sharp and merciless as a blade. Notice of eviction. She had until the end of the week. The landlord, a man with a perpetually down-turned mouth and eyes that never quite met hers, had been patient, but his patience, like her savings, had run dry. The apartment was a landscape of her despair. Half-filled packing crates stood like tombstones in the dim light. She had sold what she could, her mother's silver, a small pearl necklace Walter had given her on their first anniversary, the fine china they had never used. Each sale felt like parting with a piece of her own skin, leaving her more exposed, more vulnerable. Now, only the essentials and the sentimental remained, a meager collection to represent a life that had once felt so full. A sudden, sharp knock on the door made her jump. It was a sound alien to the quiet rhythm of her grief. No one visited anymore. The friends who had flocked to the funeral with their casseroles and somber condolences had slowly retreated, their own bright, bustling lives pulling them away from the gravity of her sorrow. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was not the hesitant rap of a neighbor or the shuffling arrival of a delivery boy. It was firm, commanding, the sound of someone who expected to be answered. Wiping a stray tear from her cheek, she smoothed down her simple morning dress and walked to the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Perhaps it was the landlord, come to deliver another verbal warning. She braced herself for the tired lecture, the feigned sympathy that barely masked his impatience. When she opened the door, the man standing in the hallway extinguished all her expectations. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit of such impeccable tailoring it seemed to absorb the dim light of the corridor. A dark fedora was angled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see a strong, square jaw and a mouth set in a firm, unsmiling line. He held the hat in his hand now, revealing dark hair slicked back from a high forehead. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a stormy sea, intense and unnervingly perceptive, and they seemed to see right through her carefully constructed composure, down to the raw, panicked heart of her. "Mrs. Holloway?" His voice was a low, resonant baritone, smooth as aged whiskey, but with an edge of steel. It filled the space between them, a sound of authority and power that was utterly out of place in her world of loss and decay. She recognized him then, not from her own life, but from the periphery of Walter's. He was a ghost from a past her husband rarely spoke of, a name mentioned in hushed, infrequent tones, Arthur Sterling, a man who, Walter had vaguely implied, operated in the city's deeper, murkier waters. The owner of the Onyx Club, a notorious jazz lounge and speakeasy that thrived in the shadows of prohibition. "Mr. Sterling," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. She clutched the doorknob, the cold metal a small solid anchor in a suddenly spinning room. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept past her, taking in the packing crates, the bare patches on the walls where pictures used to hang, the pervasive air of defeat that clung to the room. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of cool neutrality. "May I come in?" It was a question, but it felt like a command. Hesitantly, Beatrice stepped back, allowing him to enter. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his presence seeming to shrink the already small apartment. He took off his coat, revealing the fine cut of his dark suit, and placed it neatly over the back of a wooden chair. He smelled of rain, expensive wool, and something else, something clean and sharp, like winter air. "I was a friend of your husband's," he said, finally turning to face her fully. "I know," she replied, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a futile barrier. "Walter didn't speak of his old life often. A wise man," Arthur said, his tone flat. "He wanted to protect you from it." His eyes flickered down to her midsection for a fraction of a second, a glance so fleeting she almost thought she'd imagined it, but she hadn't. He knew. The realization sent a chill down her spine. How could he possibly know? "Why are you here, Mr. Sterling?" she asked again, her voice firmer this time. The initial shock was giving way to a rising tide of suspicion. Men like Arthur Sterling didn't pay social calls out of sympathy. They moved with purpose, and their purpose was rarely charitable. "I know about your situation, Mrs. Holloway," he stated, his directness a physical blow. "The debts, the eviction notice. I know you have nowhere to go." Beatrice flinched as if he'd struck her, her private shame laid bare by this stranger. "How?" "It is my business to know things," he cut in, his voice softening slightly, though it lost none of its underlying authority. "Walter was my friend. We served together in the war. We made certain promises to one another, promises to look out for what was important, should the worst happen. The war." Walter had walls around those memories, locked rooms in his mind she had never been allowed to enter. He'd brought back a medal for bravery, and a darkness in his eyes that only ever vanished when he looked at her. "A promise," she repeated numbly. "That's why you're here. To honor a promise to a dead man." "Yes." He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to retreat. "I am here to ensure that his wife and his child are cared for." There it was again, his child. The secret she had guarded so closely was apparently no secret to him at all. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. Who was this man? What power did he wield that he could uncover the most intimate details of her life? "I don't need your charity, Mr. Sterling," she said, her pride a flimsy shield. A flicker of something, was it amusement, or perhaps sadness, crossed his features before vanishing. "This is not charity. It is a solution, a proposition." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his gaze unwavering. Beatrice felt like a butterfly pinned to a board, examined and dissected by his intense stare. The saxophone outside began a new song, a faster, more frantic melody that matched the frantic beating of her own heart. "I want you to marry me, Mrs. Holloway." The words hung in the air, so preposterous, so utterly insane, that for a moment Beatrice thought she had misheard. He stared at him, searching his face for any sign of a cruel joke, but his expression was deadly serious. The rain hammered against the glass, a frantic, percussive rhythm to her disbelief. "Marry you," she choked out, a laugh bubbling up in her throat, sharp and hysterical. "You can't be serious. I don't know you. You are a stranger. I am a man who can offer you and your child safety and security. A home, a name," he countered, his voice steady and calm, a rock against the storm of her emotions. "Your child will want for nothing. You will be protected. I can give you a life free from the fear that is currently eating you alive." His words were true. The fear was a constant companion, a gnawing beast in the pit of her stomach. But this was madness. To tie herself to a man like him, a man whose world was built on secrets and shadows, a gangster. It was unthinkable. "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why would you do this? What do you get out of it? No man does something like this out of the goodness of his heart. Not a man like you." Arthur's gaze held hers, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his formidable composure, a flicker of a deep, ancient pain. "I owe Walter a debt that can never truly be repaid," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is the only way I know how to honor him, by protecting what was most precious to him." He looked at her then, at the widow in her threadbare mourning dress, pregnant, destitute, and utterly alone. The world outside offered her nothing but the cold, unforgiving street. The man inside, a dangerous enigma, was offering her salvation, wrapped in a gilded cage. The choice was impossible: ruin or a life shackled to a stranger with a dark past. He stood there, patient, waiting, as if he knew that in the end she had no choice at all. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating, broken only by the drumming of the rain against the window pane. Beatrice stared at Arthur Sterling, her mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his words. Marry him. It was a proposal born of madness, a solution so extreme it bordered on the grotesque. "You're insane," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "I am in mourning. My husband, Walter, has only been gone for 3 months. To speak of marriage is an insult. Grief is a luxury, Mrs. Holloway, one you can no longer afford," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of malice but filled with a chilling pragmatism. "In 1 week, you and your child will be on the street. Is that a more fitting tribute to Walter's memory? To have his son born in a charity ward?" His words were cruel, but they struck with the undeniable force of truth. Every syllable was a hammer blow to her pride, shattering the fragile defenses she had erected around her sorrow. He saw her not as a grieving widow, but as a problem to be solved, an equation to be balanced. "There are other ways," she insisted, though even as she said it, the words sounded hollow and desperate. "I can find work." "I can." "You can what?" he interjected, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly, a fleeting shadow of pity in his stormy eyes. "Sew dresses until your fingers bleed for a few dollars a week. Take in laundry until your back breaks. This city is not kind to women alone, and it is crueler still to those with a child on the way. The world is moving on, Beatrice. Jazz, liquor, money. It doesn't stop for grief. It will swallow you whole." He had used her first name. It slipped from his lips with an unnerving familiarity, as if he had spoken it 1,000 times before. It unsettled her more than his proposal. "Why?" she pleaded, taking a step back toward the cold comfort of the wall. "This debt you speak of, what could Walter have possibly done for you to warrant this grand, impossible gesture?" Arthur turned away from her then, walking to the window and staring out at the rain-slicked street below. For a long moment he was silent, his broad shoulders a formidable silhouette against the blurred city lights. "During the war," he began, his voice low and strained, "in the mud and the chaos of the Argonne forest, a man's character is laid bare. There are no pretenses, no lies. There is only the man next to you and the enemy in front of you. Walter, he was the best of us. He pulled me from a crater under heavy fire. He carried me 1/2 mile to an aid station while I was bleeding out. He saved my life." The story was simple, a classic tale of battlefield bravery. But as he spoke, Beatrice sensed a deep, unplumbed well of emotion behind the words. There was more, so much more that he wasn't saying. His explanation felt like a carefully constructed wall, solid and believable, but designed to hide whatever lay behind it. "He would have done the same for anyone," she whispered, remembering Walter's inherent goodness, his easygoing kindness. "Perhaps," Arthur conceded, turning back to face her, "but he did it for me. And, before we went over the top that day, we made a pact. If one of us fell, the other would ensure that everything we left behind was protected. I am merely honoring my word." He was a fortress, impenetrable. His logic was sound, his reasoning noble on the surface. Yet an instinct, deep and primal, warned her that this was not about a debt to Walter. This was about her. The intensity in his gaze was not that of a man honoring a fallen comrade. It was something more focused, more personal, more possessive. She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Her hand went to her belly. A life, innocent and unknowing, was depending on her. She thought of the cold, the hunger, the shame of destitution. She imagined trying to raise a child in a world that had already proven its capacity for cruelty. And then she looked at Arthur Sterling, a man of shadows and violence, of whispered rumors and untold wealth. He was offering a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. Could she condemn her child to one fate to save it from another? The answer was a bitter pill. She closed her eyes, and Walter's smiling face swam in her memory. "Forgive me," she thought. "There would be conditions," she said, her voice small but clear. Arthur's posture relaxed infinitesimally. He had one, of course. "This would be a marriage in name only," she stated, looking him directly in the eye, willing him to see the non-negotiable line she was drawing. "A business arrangement. You will be my child's guardian, its benefactor, but you will not be my husband." A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of his reaction. "You will have your own rooms. Your privacy will be respected, always. I ask for nothing from you, Beatrice, except your acceptance of my protection." "And what do you expect in return?" "That you play the part," he said simply. "You will be Mrs. Sterling. You will live in my home. You will give my name to your child. In public, you will afford me the respect due a husband. In private, we will be as strangers who share a roof." It was a cold, stark contract. Her life, her future, her child's identity, all traded for a roof and a name. She felt a profound wave of loneliness wash over her, more desolate than any she had felt since Walter's death. She was making a deal with a man she should fear, surrendering her freedom for the illusion of safety. "I accept," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The wedding, 2 days later, was as soulless as the agreement that had birthed it. It took place in a dusty, wood-paneled office at City Hall, presided over by a bored justice of the peace, who mumbled the vows as if reciting a grocery list. Beatrice wore her best black dress, an ironic choice for a bride. She felt like a ghost at her own ceremony, a phantom bride marrying a man of shadows. Arthur stood beside her, impeccably dressed, his face a mask of stone. His only concession to the event was a single, perfect white gardenia he had handed her before they left the car, its sweet fragrance a jarring note in the sterile air. When the time came, she murmured, "I do" to the stained ceiling tiles. Arthur's "I do" was a firm, resonant sound that seemed to seal her fate with a terrifying finality. He slid a ring onto her finger. It was not a simple gold band, but a heavy platinum ring set with a single, square-cut diamond that glittered with a cold, unforgiving fire. It felt foreign on her hand, a beautiful, unwelcome manacle. There were no guests, no family, no joyous celebration. The only witness was a silent, grim-faced man named Howard, who Arthur had introduced as his driver, but whose watchful eyes and stiff posture suggested he was much more than that. The moment the certificate was signed, Arthur placed a cool, proprietary hand on the small of her back and guided her out of the building and into a gleaming black Cadillac, a car grander than any she had ever set foot in. The drive to her new home was silent. Beatrice stared out the window as the familiar, struggling neighborhoods gave way to tree-lined avenues and imposing mansions set back from the road behind wrought-iron fences. It was another world, a universe away from her cramped apartment and the life she had known. The car turned into a long, winding driveway and stopped before a house that was more fortress than home. It was a sprawling stone edifice of dark grey granite, with tall mullioned windows that looked like vacant eyes. It was magnificent, imposing, and utterly without warmth. Howard opened her door, and Arthur was there to help her out. He led her up the grand stone steps and through a pair of massive oak doors into a foyer that could have swallowed her entire apartment. The floors were black and white marble, polished to a mere shine. A cavernous silence filled the air, broken only by the echo of their footsteps. A grand staircase swept upwards into the gloom. A woman emerged from the shadows. She was tall and severe, dressed in a crisp black uniform, her grey hair pulled back into a tight, unforgiving bun. "Mrs. Norris, this is my wife, Beatrice," Arthur said, his voice flat. "She will be the mistress of the house. See to it that she has everything she requires. Her things from the apartment will arrive shortly." The housekeeper, Mrs. Norris, gave Beatrice a curt, professional nod, her eyes sweeping over Beatrice's simple dress with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, but simply assessing. "Welcome, madame. Mrs. Norris will show you to your rooms," Arthur said to Beatrice, his tone polite but distant. He was already shrugging off his coat, the husband in name only, already retreating into his own world. "I have business to attend to. We will dine at 8. He turned and disappeared down a long, dark-paneled hallway without a backward glance. Beatrice was left standing in the cavernous hall with the stern housekeeper, the diamond on her finger feeling heavier than ever. "If you'll follow me, madam," Mrs. Norris said, her voice as starched as her uniform. Beatrice followed her up the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the cold, smooth mahogany banister. She was led down a wide, carpeted hallway to a set of double doors. Mrs. Norris opened them to reveal a suite of rooms that took Beatrice's breath away. Spacious sitting room with a fireplace and silk-upholstered chairs led into a bedroom dominated by a vast four-pastor bed draped in cream-colored damask. The furniture was elegant, the carpets plush, the windows overlooking a manicured, desolate garden. It was the most beautiful prison she had ever seen. She was safe. She was secure. Her child would want for nothing. She had gotten everything she had bargained for. Standing alone in the center of the magnificent, silent room, Beatrice Holloway, now Beatrice Sterling, had never felt more profoundly, terrifyingly alone. The days that followed bled into one another, each marked by the same quiet, opulent monotony. Beatrice woke each morning in the vast four-poster bed, the fine linen sheets cool against her skin, the morning light filtering softly through heavy silk curtains. Her former life, with its constant, gnawing anxiety over pennies and dimes, felt like a distant, feverish dream. Here, in Arthur Sterling's mansion, there was no want, only a profound and aching emptiness. The house was a silent kingdom, and she was its solitary, ornamental queen. Mrs. Norris, the housekeeper, managed the staff and the daily rhythm of the estate with an iron-willed efficiency that left no room for casual conversation. Meals were served punctually in a cavernous dining room where Beatrice sat at one end of a long, polished mahogany table, and Arthur, when he was present, sat at the other. The distance between them was a physical manifestation of the chasm in their lives. Their conversations were brief, stilted exchanges about the weather or her health. He would inquire if she was comfortable, if the doctor he'd sent to see her had been satisfactory, if there was anything she required. Her answers were always polite, always concise. Yes, thank you. I am well. I need nothing. Yet his devotion, as he had called it, was a constant silent presence. It was not in words or tender gestures, but in actions, executed with the detached precision of a business transaction. A new wardrobe appeared in her closet, as if by magic, filled with exquisite drop-waist dresses of silk and crêpe de chine, soft cashmere shawls, and elegant cloche hats she had no occasion to wear. A brand-new gramophone was delivered to her sitting room, along with a curated collection of records, not the frantic, riotous jazz he was known for, but calming classical pieces and gentle ballads. Books she had once mentioned enjoying in passing to Walter appeared on her nightstand. He was an observer, a ghost in her life who catered to needs she never voiced, anticipating her comfort while keeping himself at an unbreachable distance. She was safe, protected, and cared for in a way she had never imagined, and she was slowly suffocating. The gilded bars of her cage were becoming more apparent with each passing day. She was free to wander the manicured gardens, where a stone-faced gardener tipped his hat but never spoke, or to sit in the library. Surrounded by thousands of books, she had no one to discuss them with. She was Mrs. Sterling, a name that commanded respect from the staff and shielded her from the harsh realities of the world. But she was not Beatrice. Beatrice, the woman who had laughed with her husband over a burnt dinner, who had dreamed of teaching her child to read, who had found joy in the simple, shared moments of a life, was fading away. One evening, as she was preparing for bed, she heard the distant sound of his Cadillac crunching up the gravel driveway. It was late, well past midnight. Curiosity, a feeling she had thought long buried, pricked at her. She crept to her window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to peer into the darkness below. Arthur emerged from the car, his posture rigid. For a moment, he stood bathed in the single beam of a porch light, and she saw that his knuckles were bruised and bloodied. He flexed his hand, his face a grim mask of controlled violence, before turning and disappearing into the house. A cold dread washed over Beatrice. This was the man she had bound herself to. A protector, yes, but a man whose protection was forged in the very darkness she feared. She retreated from the window, her hand resting on her swelling stomach, a silent prayer on her lips for the child who would bear this man's name. The Onyx Club was Arthur's true kingdom, tucked away in a discreet downtown basement, hidden behind the facade of a wholesale florist. It was the beating heart of his empire. The air inside was thick with the sweet, cloying scent of illegal gin, expensive perfume, and forbidden cigarette smoke. A 7-piece band on a small stage drove a relentless, syncopated rhythm, a siren song for the city's restless souls. Flappers with bobbed hair and daringly short skirts danced the Charleston with men in sharp suits. Their laughter mixing with the clinking of glasses and the low hum of illicit dealings. Arthur sat in his usual booth in the back, a dark, secluded alcove that offered a commanding view of the entire room. He nursed a glass of whiskey, his stormy eyes scanning the crowd, missing nothing. This was his world, a world of calculated risks and brutal consequences, a world he had fought to keep separate from the silent stone mansion on the hill. Quite the prize you've snagged for yourself, Sterling. The voice was smooth as silk and just as dangerous. Arthur didn't need to look up to know who it was. Stanley Miller slid into the booth opposite him, a predatory grin fixed on his handsome, cruel face. Stanley was his chief rival, a man who dealt in narcotics and vice with a flamboyance that Arthur found distasteful. Where Arthur commanded loyalty through fear and a strict code of honor, Stanley ruled through chaos and betrayal. "Miller," Arthur acknowledged, his voice flat, "I don't recall inviting you to my table." "Oh, come now, Arthur. We're colleagues in this grand enterprise," Stanley purred, lighting a cigarette with a gold lighter. He exhaled a plume of smoke. "The whole city is talking. The great Arthur Sterling, the Stone Man, suddenly takes a wife, a widow no less, pregnant with another man's child. It's almost poetic. Tell me, is it pity, or has love finally made you soft?" Arthur's hand tightened around his glass. "My wife is not a topic for discussion, but she's such an interesting topic." Stanley leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malice. "I hear she's a real beauty. A delicate flower, not at all suited for our garden. It makes a man wonder. A man with so much to protect is a man with so much to lose. A wife, a child. These are liabilities, Arthur. Anchors that can drag a man down to the bottom." Every word was a veiled threat, a poisoned dart aimed at the one vulnerable point in Arthur's armor. Stanley saw Beatrice not as a person, but as leverage, a weakness to be exploited. The raw, protective fury that surged through Arthur was so potent it was almost a physical force. He imagined closing his hands around Stanley's throat, but he kept his face a mask of cold indifference. "You would be wise to forget you ever learned her name," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "My affairs are my own. Stay out of them." Stanley laughed, a short, ugly sound. Of course. Forgive my professional curiosity. It's just that a fortress is only as strong as its weakest wall, and you, my friend, have just built a beautiful, fragile one made of glass." He stood up, adjusting the lapels of his suit. "Give my best to the new Mrs. Sterling." With a final, mocking smirk, he disappeared back into the swirling, smoke-filled crowd. Arthur remained in the booth long after he was gone, the jazz music a discordant clamor in his ears. The whiskey in his glass remained untouched. Stanley's words had confirmed his deepest fear. By bringing Beatrice into his life to protect her, he had inadvertently placed her in the center of the target. His gilded cage had not just trapped her, it had illuminated her for every predator in the city to see. He had thought he could keep his two worlds separate, but he saw now that was a fool's hope. The shadows of the Onyx Club were long, and they were creeping inexorably toward the one person he had sworn to keep in the light. The boxes arrived on a Tuesday. They were delivered without fanfare by Arthur's silent driver, Howard, and deposited in the vast, unused attic at the top of the house. Mrs. Norris informed Beatrice of their arrival with her usual clipped efficiency. "Your effects have been placed in the North Wing attic, madame. Should you require assistance sorting them?" It was a statement, not an offer. For days Beatrice avoided the attic. The thought of unpacking the remnants of her old life, of touching the objects that had formed the fabric of her marriage to Walter, was a pain she was not yet ready to face. But the suffocating silence of the mansion, the endless, empty hours, eventually drove her up the narrow servants' staircase. The air in the attic was thick with the scent of cedar and dust. Pale sunlight streamed through a single round window, illuminating dancing motes of dust in its beam. The half-dozen crates looked small and pathetic in the cavernous space. She opened the first one, Walter's clothes. The familiar smell of his tweed jacket, a phantom scent of pipe tobacco and bay rum, rose to meet her, and a fresh wave of grief, sharp and potent, washed over her. She quickly closed the lid. The next box held kitchenware, a chipped teapot, mismatched plates, the humble artifacts of a life lived on love and little else. It all felt like it belonged to another woman, a ghost who had once been happy. It was in the last box, tucked beneath a stack of Walter's favorite poetry books, that she found it. A small, dark mahogany box with a tarnished brass lock. She knew it instantly. It was Walter's memory box, a place where he kept things he deemed too precious for a simple drawer. He had once shown it to her, but never its contents. Her old apartment key was still on a chain round her neck, a habit she hadn't broken. Tucked amongst the keys was a tiny, ornate one. Walter had told her it was the key to his heart, a foolish, romantic notion she had cherished. With trembling fingers, she fitted the small key into the lock. It turned with a soft, metallic click. The contents were sparse: a pressed flower, a few military medals, and a small stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a single, dog-eared photograph. She picked it up. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of two young men, little more than boys, standing on a wooden pier with a sparkling lake behind them. One was instantly recognizable as Walter, his arms slung casually over his companion's shoulder, a wide, carefree grin splitting his face. The other boy, taller and more serious, was Arthur. He was younger than she had ever seen him, his face unlined by the harshness that now defined it, his dark hair tousled by the wind. But it was his expression that made her heart stop. He wasn't looking at the camera. His gaze was directed slightly off-center, and in his stormy eyes was a look of such profound, unguarded longing and melancholy that it seemed completely at odds with the sunny day and Walter's cheerful grin. It was the look of a man staring at something beautiful and unattainable. She turned the photograph over. Scrawled on the back, in Walter's familiar cursive, was a date and a place: Lake Geneva, summer 1917. Before everything changed, 1917, before the war. Arthur's words echoed in her mind. We served together in the war. We made certain promises. He had made it sound as if their friendship had been forged in the trenches of France. But this photograph told a different story. They were friends long before that. He had lied to her. It was not a lie of malice, perhaps, but a lie of omission, a deliberate reshaping of the truth. Why? Her fingers fumbled with the blue ribbon round the letters. They were not love letters, but correspondences between the two men. Most were mundane, but a few were drafts Walter had written to Arthur, their pages filled with crossed-out words and frustrated revisions. It was in these unfinished thoughts that she found the real story. Art, one letter began, dated shortly after her own engagement to Walter. You're a better man than I am. You always have been. She deserves someone like you, someone solid and true, but I'm too damn selfish to let her go. Forgive me. Another, written a year later, was more agonizing. Why you insist on playing the martyr, I'll never understand. What happened that summer was a mistake, a foolish choice I made. Your sacrifice is noble, but it's breaking 3 hearts instead of 1. Don't do this to yourself, or to her. 3 hearts. A sacrifice. Her mind reeled. What had happened that summer? Who was the third heart? The final fragment she read made the world tilt. It was a small, torn piece of paper, seemingly a note Walter had jotted down to himself. Saw B today at the market. That smile. You were right. It could launch ships. How can a man be expected to walk away from that? B. Beatrice. She dropped the letters as if they had burnt her. The narrative Arthur had so carefully constructed, a simple story of a war debt, was a lie, a facade built to hide a far more complex and painful truth, a truth that involved her. The sacrifice Walter spoke of was not Arthur's, it was Walter's. Or was it? Her head spun with confusion. Arthur's silent devotion, his strange, intense focus on her well-being, the way he had known about her pregnancy. It all began to click into a terrible, incomprehensible pattern. His connection was not to Walter, it was to her. He had known her, or at least known of her, long before she had ever met him. That evening she waited for him. She did not go down for dinner, but sat in the dark of her sitting room. The photograph and the letters laid out on the small table before her, like pieces of evidence in a trial. When she heard his footsteps in the hall, she opened her door. He stopped, surprised to see her there. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "Beatrice, is everything all right? We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. He followed her into the room, his gaze immediately falling on the items on the table. She saw his body go rigid, the formidable composure he always wore cracking for a split second. A flash of something raw pain, regret, anger crossed his face before the mask of stone slammed back into place. She held up the photograph. "You told me you were war buddies. This was taken in 1917. You knew him long before that. You lied to me." He didn't deny it. He simply stared at the image of his younger self, his jaw tight. "That is a lifetime ago, is it?" she challenged, her voice rising. She picked up one of the letter fragments. "Walter wrote about a sacrifice. Your sacrifice. He wrote that you were the better man, that I deserved someone like you." What did he mean, Arthur? What is the real debt you're paying? It has nothing to do with the war, does it? He finally looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was a physical blow. It was the look he had given Stanley Miller in the club, a look that warned of danger. "You were not meant to see those," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "But I did see them, and I deserve an explanation. My life is entangled with yours. My child will bear your name. I have a right to know the truth. The truth is that you are safe," he bit out, taking a step toward her. "The truth is that your child will be cared for. That is our arrangement. The past has no bearing on it. It has every bearing on it," she cried, a new and unexpected feeling rising within her. Before this moment she had started to feel a flicker of something for this strange protective man, a reluctant admiration, a nascent tenderness. She had seen glimpses of a gentle soul beneath the hardened exterior, but now his deception felt like a betrayal, poisoning whatever fragile trust had begun to grow. "This isn't about Walter, is it? It was always about me." He flinched. The direct hit had found its mark. He stared at her, his face a battleground of warring emotions, but the walls were already being rebuilt, higher and colder than before. "Enough," he commanded, his voice like ice. "Our agreement was for your protection, not for an excavation of my history. What's done is done. We will not speak of this again." He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. The sound echoed the closing of a door in her own heart. He hadn't just refused to explain, he had forbidden her from asking. Beatrice sank into a chair, the photograph still clutched in her hand. The man who had saved her from ruin was not her protector. He was her jailer, and the bars of her gilded cage were not made of gold, but of secrets he refused to share. The silence that filled the grand house was no longer just empty. It was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and a past that was very much alive. Do you believe love can overcome time? Let me know in the comments. The wall of silence Arthur erected between them in the following week was more impenetrable than stone. He became a ghost in his own house, his presence marked only by the distant hum of his Cadillac, leaving before dawn and returning long after she had retired to her rooms. The polite, if sterile, dinners ceased. Her meals were brought to her suite on a silver tray by a silent maid. He was punishing her for her questions, isolating her further, forcing her back into the role of a protected ward with no right to a past, his or her own. But his silence did the opposite of what he intended. It did not quell Beatrice's curiosity. It fed it. The fragments of truth she had unearthed festered in the quiet of her gilded cage. The photograph of the young, longing Arthur, Walter's cryptic words of sacrifice, they played on a loop in her mind, creating a narrative of a great, unspoken tragedy in which she was the unwitting centerpiece. The new tenderness she had begun to feel for him curdled into a mixture of fear and resentment. She was living a lie, raising a child in a house built on deception. The safety he provided felt tainted, the silk sheets like a shroud. She looked at her reflection in the ornate mirrors, and saw a stranger with haunted eyes. This was not a life. It was a beautifully furnished waiting room for a future she had no part in creating. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a desperate, primal instinct for survival. She could not stay. She could not raise her child in the shadow of a man who refused to show her his heart. A man whose kindness was a form of control and whose protection felt like a prison sentence. Her escape was pathetically simple. One morning, after confirming Arthur had left for the day, she packed a single small valise. She took only one of the new dresses, a practical wool one, and filled the rest of the bag with the meager belongings from her old life. She took no money beyond the few dollars she still had in her purse. To take his would be to acknowledge his claim on her. On her dresser, she left the platinum and diamond ring, its cold fire a symbol of the life she was rejecting. Beside it, she placed a short, simple note, written on a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for your generosity, but I cannot live this way. I release you from whatever debt you feel you owe. We will be fine on our own. Beatrice." She walked out the front door without a backward glance. No one stopped her. She walked a long, winding driveway to the main road, a lone figure in a world of wealth and privilege, and boarded the first public omnibus that rumbled past, its destination unimportant. All that mattered was that it was taking her away. She found a train station, and, with the last of her money, bought a one-way ticket to a place she'd only ever seen on a map, a small, quiet town called Havenwood, nestled in the countryside 3 hours away. Its name sounded like a promise. The Onyx Club was unusually quiet when Arthur arrived, the afternoon lull before the evening storm. He walked straight to his office, the note from Beatrice clutched in his fist, the paper crinkled and warm from the force of his grip. He had found it hours ago. The sight of the ring on the polished wood, a more devastating blow than any bullet he had ever faced. He had driven the city for hours, a cold, methodical surge born of rising panic. He checked her old apartment, the cemetery where Walter was buried, the small parks she might have known. Nothing. She had vanished as completely as a wisp of smoke. He sank into the leather chair behind his desk, the silence of the office pressing in on him. The facade of the powerful, controlled gangster had crumbled, leaving behind a man hollowed out by a loss so profound it stole the air from his lungs. He'd orchestrated everything with such precision, rescuing her from ruin, surrounding her with comfort, protecting her from the ugliness of his world. He had done it all to keep her safe, to finally, after all these years, honor the silent vow he had made to himself that day by the lake. And, in his clumsy, heavy-handed attempt to protect her, he had driven her away. He had caged a bird, and been surprised when it flew the moment the door was left ajar. His life, which had been a carefully balanced ledger of risk and reward, was now in free fall. Without her, the mansion was just a pile of stones. The money was just paper. The power was a hollow crown. Her absence left him exposed, reckless. The very thing Stanley Miller had predicted had come to pass. His greatest strength, his lifelong secret devotion to Beatrice, had become his fatal weakness. Havenwood was everything Chicago was not. The air was clean and smelled of pine and damp earth. The streets were quiet, the houses modest and well-kept. Beatrice found a room to let above a bakery, a small, clean space that cost next to nothing. The baker's wife, a kind, round woman named Mildred, asked no questions, simply clucking her tongue in sympathy at the sight of Beatrice's swollen belly and the sadness in her eyes. For 2 weeks, Beatrice breathed freely for the first time in months. She helped Mildred in the bakery, in exchange for her rent and board, the simple, rhythmic work of kneading dough, a soothing balm to her fractured soul. She took long walks in the crisp autumn air, the fear that had been her constant companion slowly receding, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Here, she was just Beatrice, not Walter's grieving widow, not Arthur's mysterious wife. She and her child could have a new life, a simple life, a life built on truth. Her peaceful existence was shattered on a cold Thursday afternoon. She was sweeping the bakery floor when the bell above the door chimed. A man stepped inside, impeccably dressed in a fine suit that was glaringly out of place in the small, rustic town. It was not Arthur. This man was handsome in a slick, predatory way, with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Mrs. Sterling, I presume," Stanley Miller said, his voice a silken menace. Beatrice froze, the broom slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. How could he have found her here? "I don't know who you are," she said, her voice shaking. "Oh, I think you do," Stanley purred, taking a step closer. He picked an invisible piece of full lint from his lapel. "My name is Stanley Miller. I'm a business associate of your husband's, and he's been terribly worried about you. In fact, his worry has made him quite careless." He circled her slowly, like a wolf sizing up its prey. "You see, when a man like Arthur Sterling has a distraction, he makes mistakes. He leaves doors unlocked. He trusts the wrong people. And people like me, we thrive on mistakes." Mildred emerged from the back room, her face creased with concern. "Is there a problem here, dearie?" "No problem at all," Stanley said, his smile widening. He reached into his coat and produced a small pearl-handled pistol, the metallic click of the safety being released unnaturally loud in the quiet shop. "We were just leaving. The lady and I have an appointment to keep. A reunion with her loving husband." Fear, cold and absolute, seized Beatrice. This was the darkness she had fled, the violence she had sensed lurking beneath Arthur's protection, and it had found her. She had not escaped her cage. She had simply flown into a far more dangerous trap. The telegram arrived like a death sentence. A lone messenger boy, looking unnervingly young, delivered the yellow envelope to the back door of the Onyx Club. Arthur's man, Howard, brought it to his office, placing it on the desk with a grim finality. Arthur had been staring at Beatrice's note for hours, the 3 short sentences a testament to his monumental failure. He had memorized the elegant slant of her handwriting, the finality of her signature. He tore open the envelope. The message was printed in stark block letters, a cold, mechanical threat. "Havenwood, the old mill, sunset, come alone. Oh, the widow pays your debt." The world contracted to the single point of those typed words. Havenwood. The name of the town meant nothing, but the implication was a blade twisting in his gut. Stanley. It had to be Stanley. He had found her. He had found Arthur's one singular vulnerability, and was now holding it hostage. The despair that had hollowed him out for days was instantly incinerated by a white-hot surge of pure, primal rage. It was followed by a wave of terror, so profound it made him physically cold. Beatrice, pregnant, alone, and in the hands of a man with no honor and no mercy. He had not protected her. He had led the wolf straight to her door. "Howard," Arthur's voice was a low growl, devoid of all its usual control. "Get the car. Now." The drive out of Chicago was a blur of speed and fury. Arthur pushed the Cadillac's engine to its limit, the powerful machine devouring the miles of country road that separated him from her. The city skyline receded in his rearview mirror, a monument to the life he had built, a life of power and fear that was utterly useless to him now. What good were money and influence if they could not protect the only thing that mattered? With every mile that passed, the carefully constructed walls around his heart, the fortress he had built over a decade of secrets and denial, began to crumble. The lie he had told Beatrice, that his actions were born of a debt to Walter, had been a lie he had also told himself. It was a noble, palatable reason for an obsession so deep and so absolute, It had governed the course of his entire adult life. The truth was, he had seen her first. It was the summer of 1917, before the world went mad with war. She was 17, a guest at a garden party at a lakeside estate where he and Walter were working for the summer. He saw her across a manicured lawn, her laughter like the chiming of a small, clear bell. She was all light and life and innocence, a creature from a world so far removed from the grit and ambition of his own that she seemed unreal. He, already tangled in the city's underbelly, already on a path toward darkness, had felt the full, devastating force of a love so pure it felt like a judgment. He knew, with a certainty that was as profound as it was painful, that he was unworthy of her. To bring her into his world would thought to be to tarnish her, to extinguish that light. So he had performed the greatest and most agonizing act of his life. He had stepped back into the shadows, and he had introduced her to his best friend, Walter Holloway, a good, kind, simple man who could offer her the clean, sunlit life she deserved. He had watched them fall in love, each stolen glance and shared smile a fresh twist of the knife in his own heart. He had gone to war to escape the sight of it, hoping the blood and mud of France could scour her from his soul. But it had only intensified his conviction. He had saved Walter on the battlefield, not just for friendship, but because Walter was her future. Walter was her happiness, and now Walter was gone, and Arthur, in his arrogant attempt to finally stand guard over her, had brought the very darkness he had sought to shield her from crashing down upon her. The sun was a fiery orange disk, sinking toward the horizon as he reached the outskirts of Havenwood. The old mill stood skeletal and silent by a sluggish river, just as the telegram described. He parked the Cadillac out of sight and approached on foot, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. His hand rested on the comforting weight of the revolver tucked in his coat. He found them in what was once the main grinding room. Dust motes danced in the slanted beams of the dying sun. Beatrice was tied to a chair, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror but defiant. Stanley Miller stood beside her, the pearl-handled pistol held loosely, almost casually, against her temple. Right on time. Sterling, Stanley sneered, his smile a flash of white in the gloom. I was beginning to think you wouldn't show. That maybe your new family wasn't quite so important after all. Arthur's gaze was locked on Beatrice. He saw the slight tremble of her lip, the fierce pride in her posture. His own terror was a physical entity, choking him, but he let none of it show on his face. "Let her go, Stanley," Arthur said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it is now," Stanley laughed, "but she makes such a convenient point of leverage. You've built an empire on having no weaknesses, Arthur, and then you go and acquire this magnificent, beautiful weakness. I have to admit I am impressed by the sheer stupidity of it. All this for what? To pay back a debt to a dead man. It's almost touching." Arthur took a slow step forward, his hands held open at his sides. "You think this is about Walter?" The words were ripped from him. "Raw and broken, isn't it?" Stanley taunted, pressing the gun a little harder against Beatrice's head. She flinched. Something inside Arthur finally broke. The years of silence, of sacrifice, of watching the woman he loved from an impossible distance. It all came pouring out, not for Stanley, but for her. His eyes found hers, and the world narrowed to the two of them. "It was never about him," he said, his voice thick with a decade of unshed emotion. "Beatrice, it was always about you." She stared at him, confusion and fear warring in her eyes. "I saw you long before Walter ever did," he confessed, the truth a torrent that could no longer be contained. "At the lake, that summer. I loved you from the first moment I saw you. But I was what I am, and you were good. You were everything pure in the world. I knew I would destroy you, so I gave you to him. I gave you to the better man, the man who deserved you." Beatrice's breath hitched. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The lies, the half-truths, the cold distance, that all clicked into place, reformed into a new, heart-stopping reality. The war, the debt. It was a story, Arthur continued, his voice cracking. An excuse I told myself so I could be near you when Walter was gone. A way to protect you, without having to admit that I have loved you every single day for 10 years. Without having to admit that watching you marry my best friend was the price I chose to pay for that love. How poetic, Stanley spat, his amusement curdling into irritation. He was losing control of the scene, a secret, pining heart. It's a shame no one will be around to write the song. He cocked the hammer of the pistol. In that split second, the lovesick confessor vanished, and the ruthless gangster returned. Arthur's movement was a blur. The revolver was in his hand, and a shot exploded through the mill, the sound deafening. Stanley cried out, not in pain, but in shock, as the pistol was shot from his grasp, clattering across the dusty floor. Before Stanley could react, Arthur was on him, a creature of pure, focused violence. The fight was short and brutal. Arthur moved with a lethal efficiency honed in back alleys and war-torn fields. There was the sickening crunch of a fist connecting with bone, a strangled gasp, and then Stanley was on the floor, unconscious and bleeding. Arthur didn't spare him a second glance. He was at Beatrice's side in an instant, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the ropes binding her wrists. The moment she was free, she launched herself into his arms, her body trembling with reaction. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent like a drowning man breathing air. He was trembling too. The iron control that had been his shield for a lifetime had shattered, leaving his heart exposed and beating wildly against hers. "Arthur," she whispered into his coat, her voice muffled. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands cupping her face. He wiped her tears away with his thumbs. In her eyes he didn't see fear anymore. He saw wonder. He saw a dawning understanding. He saw the reflection of the truth he had just laid bare at her feet. "It was always you," he said again, his voice now just a ragged whisper. "It was always, only you." The aftermath of the violence was a profound silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets outside and the ragged sound of their breathing. The last rays of sunset painted the dusty air in hues of rose and violet, a soft, beautiful light that seemed entirely out of place in the scene of brutality. Arthur held Beatrice, not with the distant, respectful care of a guardian, but with the desperate, grounding embrace of a man who had nearly lost everything. He gently examined her wrists, his touch surprisingly tender on the raw red marks left by the ropes. His own knuckles were raw and split, a stark reminder of the darkness he carried within him. He shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it around her trembling shoulders. The scent of hymn wool, winter air, and the faint, metallic tong of the confrontation enveloped her. A scent that was no longer frightening, but protective, solid, real. "We need to go," he said, his voice low and strained. He looked at Stanley's unconscious form on the floor, with a cold detachment that chilled her, yet she understood it. Stanley was a problem, and Arthur was a man who solved problems. He led her out of the dilapidated mill and back into the cool evening air. The world outside felt preternaturally calm, the sky a canopy of deepening twilight studded with the first stars. He didn't speak as he guided her to the waiting Cadillac, his hand a constant, warm pressure on the small of her back. The truth he had confessed hung in the air between them, a living entity, fragile and new, and shimmering with a decade of unspoken emotion. It had changed everything. The secrets that had been a wall between them had become, in their revelation, a bridge. The drive back to Chicago was a quiet cocoon. Beatrice watched the dark, rolling countryside fly by, the headlights cutting a lonely path through the night. She looked at Arthur's profile in the dim glow of the dashboard, the strong line of his jaw, the tension still etched around his mouth, the way his bruised hands gripped the steering wheel. This was the real man, not just the cold protector or the ruthless gangster, but a man who had loved her with a silent, steadfast, and heartbreaking devotion. A man who had built his life around a sacrifice she had never even known he'd made. When they finally arrived back at the imposing stone mansion, it no longer felt like a prison. As Arthur led her through the massive oak doors into the grand, silent foyer, it felt, for the first time, like coming home. Mrs. Norris appeared, her severe face showing the barest flicker of surprise and relief, but Arthur dismissed her with a slight shake of his head. He wanted no one else between them. He led her not to her separate suite, but to the library, a warm, book-lined room she had always loved. A low fire was crackling in the hearth, casting a dancing golden light over the leather-bound volumes. He poured 2 small glasses of brandy, handing one to her before sinking wearily into a deep armchair. She did not sit opposite him. Instead, she came to his side, perching on the arm of his chair, her proximity a question. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes searching hers, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "Beatrice," he began, his voice rough, "what I did, the life I lead, it is not a world for you or for your child. I understand if you still wish to leave. I will not stop you. I will set you up somewhere safe, anywhere you wish to go. You will be provided for, discreetly. You can be free." It was the ultimate act of his devotion. After everything, after confessing a love that had cost him so much, he was offering her an exit, putting her happiness, her freedom, above his own. She reached out and gently touched his bruised hand. His skin was warm. He flinched slightly at her touch, as if unaccustomed to such simple tenderness. "You told me once that you were not a good man, Arthur," she said softly, her voice clear in the quiet room. "You believed Walter was the better man. But a good man is one who is kind. A better man is one who is true. But the best man, he is the one who loves so completely that he is willing to sacrifice his own heart for the happiness of another. That is what you did." His breath hitched, and he closed his eyes, the confession in her words too much to bear. "I'm not leaving," she continued, her voice firm. "Not unless you send me away." He opened his eyes, and the relief that washed over his features was so profound it was like watching a sunrise after a long, dark night. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, their first true voluntary touch. "I will never send you away," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "But things must change. For you, for the child, the club, the business. I will untangle myself from it. It will take time, but I will build a world that is clean for you. A world you deserve." In the months that followed, Arthur was true to his word. It was a slow, quiet, and undoubtedly dangerous process of extrication. Men with grim faces came and went from the mansion, their meetings held behind the closed doors of his study. But gradually, the shadows began to recede. Arthur was home more often, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. Their evenings were spent not in a cavernous dining hall, but here, in the library, talking for hours, sharing the stories of the years they had lost, tentatively, carefully, building a new foundation of truth and trust. He was a man, rediscovering how to live in the light, and she was the one teaching him. She, in turn, was learning to love the complex, flawed, and fiercely devoted man who had loved her for so long. Their love, born in a secret, forged in tragedy, and revealed in violence, finally began to blossom in the quiet peace of their shared home. When her son was born in the early spring, it was Arthur who was by her side, his hand holding hers, his presence a calm, unshakable anchor. The baby was small and perfect, with a tuft of Walter's fair hair, but as he opened his eyes for the first time, Beatrice saw in them a familiar, stormy grey. Later that evening, Arthur came into her room, where she was rocking the baby by the window. He stood beside her, looking down at the small bundle in her arms, his face filled with a wonder and awe that seemed to erase the last vestiges of his hard past. "He is a beautiful boy," Arthur whispered. "Walter would have been so proud." "We will tell him all about his father," Beatrice said softly. "We will tell him how brave and good he was." She paused, then looked up at Arthur, her heart full. "And we will tell him about the man who gave him a name and a home, the man who loved his mother enough to build a new world for them both." Arthur reached out, his finger gently tracing the baby's cheek. He then looked at Beatrice, his love for her a clear, steady light in his eyes, no longer hidden in shadow. The cage was gone, its gilded bars melted away by the truth. Outside, the city was roaring into a new evening, the sound of jars and life spilling into the streets. But here, in this quiet room, a new melody was beginning, a soft, hopeful tune played on the heartstrings of a family forged not by blood, but by the purest, most unwavering devotion. It was the melody of their tomorrow. True devotion is not measured in grand gestures or possessive protection, but in the silent, selfless sacrifice of one's own happiness for the well-being of another. This story teaches us that love's greatest strength is often found in its quietest moments, and that even a heart shrouded in darkness and secrets can be redeemed by a truth powerful enough to build a new world in the light. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.